There's a famous quotation from an African tribe. It says, "You don't leave a whole story in the mind, you must share it with your people, or the things in your mind will be buried with you, and you'll have no heritage." I started to become interested in the deaf Holocaust when I met a deaf couple from Philadelphia in 1957. I'd never really given much thought about deaf survivors of the Holocaust or in concentration camps until I had met this couple. What had happened was they saw that I was eating and being very fussy, and they said, "Hey, come on. When we were in the camp, anything that moved, we would take it and eat it." And I was shocked. I said, "You? You?" And I became almost obsessed from that time. From time to time, I would read books or I would see movies. But for deaf people, I'd never thought about it because, growing up in an oral school, I didn't know a lot of deaf people. I thought I was one of the few deaf people on Earth until I went to Gallaudet University and started meeting a lot of different deaf students and teachers and people outside of Gallaudet. I started seeing more and more deaf people. I had never really thought of survivors of the Holocaust until this couple. There was Regina, the wife, and Sol, S-O-L, Goldfinger, from Philadelphia. Well, I had asked them to interview, maybe in their home or in a TV studio, but they were very reluctant and didn't want to return my calls or my letters. Finally, I sat with their daughter and I said how important it was to be able to get this information from a deaf perspective, and she never answered my letter. Finally, I went to visit a friend in Philadelphia and said, why don't we have them over to the house and talk? I mean, I don't want to force anyone. My friend had told me that both of them were coming over to his house to play cards, and I thought this would be perfect. So that evening, I got to meet them, and we asked how they were doing, and Saul said that, please don't leave us. We don't want to talk about this or relive it. And of course, I wanted to respect their feelings because, they had gone to different camps, 3 or 4 different camps, and he had worked as a person who had to, pull out the dead bodies. This wasn't something that he told me. Another person had told me that he was also a cook at Auschwitz until the war was over. So after the war was that, I don't really know what happened. So when I saw those stories, I wasn't bothering with collecting data or anything like that. I mean, I was a physicist. I was working for the government at the time. I didn't have the intent of writing articles or anything. It was more of a hobby, collecting some information about deaf survivors just for my own mind. And then I met a woman at a Jewish convention center in Washington, D.C. In the cafeteria. We sat down, and she had looked at me and waved, and I waved back, and she said that she was from Hungary. And so we sat down and we started talking, and she talked about her experience in the Holocaust, not in a concentration camp, but in a ghetto in Budapest. She was there for many, many months. She didn't give me a whole lot of information, and then she invited me to come to New York to meet some of her deaf friends from Europe at a party. And she also told me that her husband was also a survivor, very, very tall, big man from a wealthy family in Poland. The husband was from Poland. He wasn't in Hungary, and he didn't mention anything about that. He just talked about how he had been selected being a big, strong man. He went to a labor camp, and he told me that he had escaped from the camp twice, and they caught him and brought him back. And I asked him, "How did you survive?" He said he had to eat the leaves off of trees. Sometimes he would go to local farms and steal some food, but then he would get caught and get sent back. He didn't have much education. His family didn't bother sending him to a deaf school or anything because they didn't think it was necessary. They thought he could live a life of leisure on the land, let him ride horses and so forth. And then he was finally imprisoned throughout the war, and afterwards moved to Canada, then to New York, and married this woman from Hungary. He had happened to be in Central Park renting a horse, because he loved horses so much, and that's how they had met. The man's name, well, his last name, I remember, was Seinwell, and his wife's name was Magda Zimmet. She had been married several times. She was wonderful. She told me a lot of stories about her experiences in Budapest, in that ghetto. Let's see. Well, there was Schertz, Joe Schertz. He was a survivor, and there was Monroe. I can't remember exactly the full name, but he went through the camp. And David Block, who was not in a camp. He escaped from Germany and went to China for 9 years. There were so many that I had met from 62 until 90. Now, at first I wanted to go back to school to study cultural anthropology because I was interested in different cultures and languages of Europe, because I was involved with the Winter Olympics on the ski team. It was time for me to make a change, too, in my career from a physicist to an anthropologist. And I didn't start with the folklore or the Holocaust until I was in Israel for 3 months doing field work, getting experience training and interviewing and meeting people that had been to camps. One woman had said and told me a story of some riddles of deaf characters in the stories, and it made me think that someone needs to start documenting this folklore of deaf people. So I went back to the U.S., and I hadn't thought about the Holocaust until it was 1980 or thereabouts, 1980, 82, where I went to the Jewish Convention Center again in Washington. And it was for a folklore and folk life. They had invited different people to sit on a panel, talk about their experiences in the Jewish deaf world. And I started to think that I saw several people in the audience, and I thought, why not invite them to speak about their experiences in the camps? So when they started telling their stories, it occurred to me that this is something that really has to be done. We have to tell the Holocaust story from the deaf perspective, and that's where it really started officially. That was around 83 or 82, somewhere in there. Yeah, we did several things. Some were frustrating and some were successful. First, I tried writing letters and sent them to different Jewish foundations to see if they would give money for filming deaf survivors. And I got no response. Then finally one or two said they didn't have money for it. So that was very frustrating. Then I met a survivor who was very willing to be on TV or film or whatever. And I met 2 or 3 others that didn't want to tell their story about their experiences or what they went through during the war for personal reasons, and you have to respect that. You can't force them. So finally, after some time, we got some people to pay attention to my research after 20 years, but we really lost in that time a lot of survivors, and it's absolutely heartbreaking. We need to be able to get the deaf survivors together to tell their story and remember their story. that they weren't alone. So many of them are so isolated from hearing people. And think in the future, if people say that the Holocaust never happened, it was just a hoax, with deaf people not being there to show them, their experience, we need to be able to have the proof. One woman named Harta, she was one of the first people that let me interview her. And her son was very surprised. He said, a lot of times you didn't want to tell people or talk about it. And she said, well, today there are more and more people saying that the Holocaust was a hoax. So, I was very impressed with her, and I got a great interview from her in Las Vegas a couple of years ago. She had a remarkable story of her experiences. I saw 5, maybe 8 videotapes of deaf survivors that they did in New York, and I read the transcript from the interpretation, the voice interpretation of the deaf survivor, and it was different. And I thought, we need to have deaf volunteers to be able to transcribe carefully what they see the deaf survivors sign. The hearing interviewers maybe didn't really understand the deaf cultural aspects. A deaf interviewer would be able to get the sign language, the deaf Holocaust issues. It's very important to catch every word, that they say, that he or she says. There were many things and also we need to have a professional photographer, not just a camera there. If they say they can't see my question, for example, we should really have 2 cameras, one for the interviewer and a monitor so they can see what's being said during the interview, during the questioning. You can see that some people didn't want to talk, they didn't want to show a lot of their emotions. You have to be very careful with them. When you do interview people, survivors of the Holocaust or others that have been through something very traumatic, you have to be very careful and know how to manage things and keep them very comfortable. Well, there was a lot of variety, but also a lot of similar experiences. We had different deaf individual survivors. There was one who had to stay in an attic, or one who had to be underground, one who was under a chicken coop for 6 to 9 months, had to get food from one of the local farmers. Another one had hidden at home and had stayed there for 2 years without ever seeing the sun. Then when the war was over, he finally got out, came to America, and found out that because he was deaf, he wasn't going to be let into the country. So they had to take a ship down to South America for a few months. They had a Hispanic quota, so they finally let him into New York. Another one I met from Holland. The parents were hearing. The deaf person was 3 to 5 years old, and they didn't know much about the German soldiers arresting the people from Holland. So they went to a farm. The parents had to hide in the attic for a few years, and then when the war was over, they came and picked up their child. So there was a happy reunion finally. Like in Berlin, the school for the deaf there, one of the directors took several children out to England. Unfortunately, 143 students from that school were sent to Auschwitz or some other camp, and they were all killed. And where are the parents? That's very, very sad. The list is very, very long. When I found that there were basically two categories of deaf people: those who hid their deafness because they knew if they told the guards that they were deaf, they'd be shot. And another group who were very open, who used sign language openly, and they had no idea or no information about that these people would kill them or kill disabled people. For example, one man, Morris Feld, he was from New York but has since moved to Utah. He had told me that while he was in a concentration camp, he saw a group of people together after work or during a break or something, and they were all using sign language, standing there in plain sight using sign language, and he was stunned. He was a member of the Deaf Club and knew a little bit of sign language, but his skills were very limited. But he saw these people and said that he knew that he shouldn't get involved with that group. And then the next day, he never saw those people again. You had to be very careful to not show the guards that you're disabled. So he was very fortunate. A lot of people didn't understand his speech because he was from a foreign country. The German people didn't understand him because he spoke Polish, and they never thought that it was because he was deaf, or they didn't recognize that. So he was very fortunate. I noticed, too, that there were some deaf people who got vocational training at their schools. So they learned skills like sewing or dentistry or different types of skills, specialty areas. And if they, especially sewing, if they could sew, then they were safe for many years in the camp. So that's how a lot of them were able to survive. Some of the guards happened to be nice to deaf people. You know, maybe they had deaf parents. Others, of course, were very mean, you know, and would try to destroy them. So I think a lot of the survivors, it really depended on their individual experiences. Well, the number of deaf people that were killed in Europe, I've read things that estimated, like in Israel, they said about 6,000 Jewish deaf people. But I don't believe it. I think it's probably closer to 10 to 25,000 deaf people were killed during World War II. And it's really hard to count because, you know, the Israeli association that found those 6,000, they didn't check on people who didn't go to deaf schools or people that were hidden in their homes, you know, or they didn't know where to look to find all these deaf people. So you have to add to those figures. Plus, a lot of families who didn't go to deaf schools were hiding their deafness. They wanted to be more like hearing people. So you have to remember that. So I would say between 10,000 and 25,000. First, I'd like to talk about Regina and Saul Goldfinger, to share with you something that she told me one time when her husband wasn't present. She had said that her mother had saved her life. She and all the deaf children and all the deaf adults had to wear an armband to show that they were disabled or deaf. The girl's mother heard about that they were going to take all the disabled people and have them executed, put them to death. So she decided to take off the armband. And people didn't bother to check on anybody. They were just looking at the armband, so that saved her life. The other one, there was a man who had a badge, and on it said Taub Stum, which meant deaf and dumb. And then it had a number. This one had to show where the camp was. So it said that Taub Stum, then the number, then beneath it said Dachau. It was very impressive to see with that. I mean, that's the type of thing we were looking for. This is very unique, very rare. This is one of the only ones in the world. It was very valuable. I tried to contact the Dachau camp, the museum there that they have, and I met the curator, but they weren't able to find any other information. You know, any research about people who had gone to America. There was just this one. I wish I had gotten to know much more about it. with all the time and the effort, to be able to go through the museum. I mean, to find the number of the badges, the people that they gave out, it was very important to say the least. And people also had the armbands or the badges. They were different colors, like, you had, for gypsies had one color, gay and lesbian had another color. There were lots of different colors that they used to code. I did do some study on this about German deaf people who were forced to be sterilized. There was about 17,000 deaf German people that were forced. I got this story from Helga Ross about her husband and her. They were forced. I wanted to talk about her husband, former husband. He had ignored the call to go to the hospital 3 different times. They didn't show up, then the police would come and arrest him. And then they would bring them to the hospital, where they laid them out ready for surgery without anesthesia. And he suffered and was very angry. He was very upset. Gallaudet University had that international conference. It was a very important event that happened in Washington. They invited me to give a presentation, and the topic was, how did I get involved with the Deaf Holocaust? And so I made a presentation from 1957 until now. Got a lot of response and support from different foundations and museums. But we had lost so many survivors in the meantime, and I explained that I hoped that someone there would take on this research to find those who are left before they're gone. So after my presentation, as I was walking out, 2 people approached me from the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and other from the Fortunoff video archives. And they had said that, we would love to work with you. But in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, where have you been? We've already lost so many people. I wish that you would, gotten back in touch when I was trying to do this initially. Because so many people have overlooked, so many deaf people that are the forgotten deaf people. We need to get I found one book where there's one sentence about a deaf survivor going through the Holocaust. One sentence. Even though it was a huge book written by someone named Gilbert, there was one sentence that had to do with deaf survivors, and that just isn't fair. That's when I decided to get to work and wanted to preserve it so that all the world could see that deaf people were involved and that they were witness to everything. Horst Weisold was an amazing man. We talked and shared a lot about different issues. I invited him to my apartment once to talk, and we had a lot of conversations in both English and German. And, I was very impressed with him. I really admire him for his starting discussion and research on German deaf people and those who were overlooked in Germany. He fought for their right to receive money for the losses they suffered. So it's very sad that the government gave about $2,000 each to victims for those who were sterilized. He wrote a book that was really very impressive. He's the one who really first thought about deaf German people. A lot of hearing people don't care about people with disabilities, and especially deaf people. I mean, it was a shock to hear that news, that he had passed. I couldn't imagine who could ever take his place. He's a huge loss. Once we finish with the Jewish deaf survivors of the Holocaust, and we are not, we are never going to finish with them. There are still lots of other deaf people to interview. Those who are in Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, Rwanda, and now most recently in Darfur, a region in the Sudan. You have to wonder about the deaf people in those countries. I'd like to interview some of them to use as sort of a warning for future generations. Are they hiding their deafness? Or are there other people murdering or euthanizing them because they cannot hear, as was done in Germany? So many things that are left to do in the future. We need a lot more deaf people researching and more hearing people working together with deaf people as a team. We have a lot coming in the future.